Karen calls 911 on Jamal Brooks for buying a puppy. She had no idea what he discovered. It was supposed to be a quiet day in the suburbs until the police sirens broke the silence. Jamal Brooks had just done something millions of Americans do every year he bought a puppy. But when a certain neighbor saw him, she didn't see a man starting a new chapter, she saw a threat. She picked up the phone, called 911, and what happened next, no one saw coming. Because what Jamal discovered after that call would uncover a secret buried deep within the heart of the neighborhood, a secret that someone had worked very hard to hide. Jamal Brooks' move to a quiet, whitened, upper-middle-class neighborhood in Atlanta was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of working tirelessly in the city's corporate world, he had finally saved enough money to buy a home in a peaceful, leafy suburb, a place where he could spend his weekends barbecuing on the back porch with his loyal husky Titan by his side. It was supposed to be the perfect place to put down U.S. roots, the dream everyone told him to aim for. But from the moment he pulled into the driveway, something didn't feel right. Shaq had barely put the car in park when he noticed the way the neighbors were watching him. A few were pretending to continue with their business, one pushing a stroller, another washing a pristine white car. But their eyes lingered just a moment too long. His stomach twisted in an unfamiliar way, and he shook off the feeling. After all, they were just curious about the new guy who wouldn't be. Yet there was one person who couldn't hide her suspicion. As Shaq unloaded boxes from his car, a woman stood in her front yard staring at him from across the street. Her perfectly maintained home, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn, stood in sharp contrast to Jamal Brooks' more modest, just-moved-in home. Her gaze was cold, scrutinizing. She was tall, with sharp features and platinum blonde hair that looked like it belonged in a magazine. She was dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored pants. Out of place for a neighborhood that seemed to be more about relaxed afternoons than high fashion, Shaq tried to ignore her, hoping she'd go back inside her house and leave him to settle in. But she didn't move. She didn't even blink. Titan, his husky, petted alongside Shaq, barking excitedly as if to say, "This place is ours now." Shaq chuckled at the dog's enthusiasm, but his humor faded when the woman's gaze shifted to him, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. She stood there, arms crossed, an unspoken judgment in her eyes. A chill ran through him, and it wasn't from the cool spring breeze. He didn't need to look twice to know exactly what was happening. The woman was sizing him up, and he could practically hear the wheels turning in her mind. Shaq had seen that look before, the skepticism, the disbelief that a black man like him could afford such a house, could have a purebred dog, could belong in a place like this. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered this kind of subtle racism, though, but it still made his blood boil. He turned back to Titan, forcing a calm smile as the dog sniffed around the yard. It wasn't the woman's fault, he told himself. She had no idea who he was, what he had achieved. Maybe she had just been raised in a bubble of privilege that couldn't, comprehend the truth about him. But as he placed a box of books in the front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just staring out of idle curiosity. 0250. There was something more to it, something sharp and calculating into the way her eyes followed his every move. He tried to shake it off and remind himself that this was his home now, and he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel unwelcome. Still, as Shaq looked over his shoulder one last time before heading inside, the woman hadn't moved. She was still watching him, her gaze unwavering, whatever he muttered under his breath. But deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. In this neighborhood, there was more at play than mere curiosity. The woman wasn't just any neighbor. Her icy stare told him everything he needed to know. She was a problem. And somehow, Shaq had a feeling that his life in this new neighborhood was about to get a lot more complicated. The days following Shaq's arrival in the quiet neighborhood of Atlanta were filled with the bustle of unpacking, organizing, and getting Shadow settled into their new home. The world outside seemed to go on as usual, but inside Shaq's mind, something lingered. A feeling of being watched, of being judged. It wasn't something he could explain, but it was real. and it made every mundane task feel like a performance under the scrutiny of unseen eyes. It was late one afternoon, as the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, that Shaq first saw Margaret Ellison up close. He had just finished walking, Titan enjoying the dog's excited barks and playful trots, when the faint sound of a voice sliced through the air. "Excuse me." Shaq turned to see her, a tall, blonde woman in her mid-40s with a face that was as polished as her perfectly trimmed garden. Her demeanor was stiff, like a person used to commanding attention rather than seeking it. Shaq's stomach tightened as he recognized her from across the street, where she had been staring at him from behind her hedges the day he moved in. Her eyes were just as cold now, but the smile she wore was plastered too wide, too forced. Yeah," Shaq responded, trying to keep his tone neutral. He wasn't sure what kind of greeting this would turn into, but he had no intention of backing down. It was his neighborhood now, too. Margaret Ellison took a few steps forward, her heels clicking against the pavement in a way that made her approach sound almost calculated. Shaq stood still, Titan at his side, sensing the tension between them like a thick fog. "I just wanted to introduce myself," she said, her smile barely concealing her disapproval. "I'm Margaret Ellison. We're neighbors, of course. I noticed you walking that dog. It's a beautiful animal," but she paused, looking down at Titan, her lips curling into a sneer. "I hope he's not a stray." Shaq blinked in confusion, not sure how to respond. Was she really accusing him of walking a stray dog? Was that her way of being friendly? "No," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with disbelief. "Titan's mine. I've had him for years. He's a purebred husky." "Oh, I see," Margaret Ellison said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A purebred, you say? I just assume. Well, I'm sure you understand. It's not every day we see someone like you in the neighborhood." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Her meaning was clear. The way she said it made Shaq's skin crawl. The subtle implication that someone like him, a black man, couldn't possibly afford or deserve to live in a neighborhood like this, let alone own a hybrid dog, hung heavy in the air. It was a small, cutting remark, but a cut nonetheless. Shaq had dealt with this kind of thinly veiled prejudice his whole life, and though he had learned to recognize it instantly, that didn't make it any easier to stomach. "I can assure you Titan's mine," Shaq said, keeping his voice steady. "I work hard for what I have, just like everyone else around here." Margaret Ellison's smile faltered for a second, then quickly returned tighter, more forced. "Of course, just making sure we wouldn't want any misunderstandings." She paused, looking around as if searching for something to confirm her suspicions. Shaq held his ground, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't about to let her get the upper hand or make him feel small in his own neighborhood. I'm sure we'll get along fine," he said flatly, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he took in the woman's expression. Margaret Ellison, sensing that she wasn't going to provoke the response she wanted, nodded curly and turned on her heel. "I'm sure we will," she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness. As she walked back to her house, Shaq felt the weight of her gaze follow him like a shadow, clinging to his every step. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uncomfortable encounter. But it wasn't just Margaret Ellison's words that lingered. It was the way she had said them. It was the underlying assumption that someone like him didn't belong in a place like this. It wasn't the first time he'd felt out of place. Of course, Shaq had spent much of his life moving through spaces where people like him were the exception, not the rule. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. That night, as Shaq sat in the living room of his new home, Shadow sprawled across the couch beside him. He couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over in his mind. Diane's behavior hadn't been just a one-off. She wasn't just a curious neighbor. She was sizing him up. She was looking for something to prove that he didn't belong here. Shaq leaned back, staring out the window at the quiet street. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, almost idyllic, but something about it didn't sit right with him. He knew he had to keep his guard up. Margaret Ellison wasn't going to let him get away with simply being here. She was going to find a way to make him feel unwelcome. And she wasn't going to stop until she succeeded. And as Shaq watched the lights flicker on in the windows of nearby homes, he realized something else. It wasn't just Margaret Ellison. The entire neighborhood had already begun to notice him, and from what he could tell, none of them were eager to embrace him. They were all watching him, and some out of curiosity, some out of suspicion, and some, like Margaret Ellison, out of something far more insidious. Shaq exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. He had known what he was walking into when he moved here. He knew that breaking into spaces where people like him were rarely seen was never going to be easy. But what Margaret Ellison and the others didn't know was that Shaq wasn't the type to back down. Not when it came to defending what was his. Shadow let out a low growl from the couch as if sensing his owner's thoughts. Shaq reached down to scratch the dog's ears, grateful for the silent support. This wasn't just a new neighborhood. It was a battleground, and Shaq was ready for whatever came next. A few days had passed since Shaq's unsettling encounter with Margaret Ellison, but the tension in the air remained palpable. Each time he stepped outside, it felt as though the neighborhood held its collective breath watching him. Some of the neighbors gave him nods or polite smiles, but there was always that lingering distance, an unspoken barrier that made it clear they weren't fully welcoming him into their fold. She didn't mind. He was used to the feeling of being an outsider. After all, he had built his life from the ground up in spaces where people like him weren't the majority. But something about this place felt different, almost like the hostility was simmering just below the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. It was on one of these mornings, as Shaq walked Shadow down the street, that things escalated. The sun was already high in the sky, casting a soft golden light across the neatly trimmed lawns and the rows of cookie-cutter homes. Shadow trotted happily beside him, his fur gleaming in the sunlight, oblivious to the tension that seemed to surround them. As Shaq walked past Diane's house, he noticed her standing in her front yard watering her flowers. Her presence was no accident. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, biding her time until she had a chance to confront him again. And when she saw him approaching, her lips curled into that same tight smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes. Shaq could feel the moment shift. His instincts told him that she wasn't just going to wave and walk away this time. There was something else in the air, something more pointed, more deliberate. Titan's ears perked up as they neared, sensing the change in his owner's energy. Shaq gave the dog a reassuring pat, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be different. He was right. "Hey!" Margaret Ellison called out sharply, her voice carrying across the yard. "You." "Yes, you with the dog. I need to talk to you." Shaq hesitated for a moment, and he didn't want to get dragged into another confrontation, but he couldn't ignore her either. With a deep breath, he turned and walked toward her Shadow, following obediently at his side. "What's up?" Shaq asked, his tone flat but polite. He had no intention of engaging in any more unnecessary back and forth with this woman, but he wasn't going to avoid her either. Margaret Ellison set the watering can down and crossed her arms, standing tall in front of him. Her stance was defensive, her expression set in a firm scowl. She looked Shaq up and down, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to find a fault, something she could latch onto. "I've been noticing something," she began, her voice laced with a sharp edge. "You're always out walking that dog all the time. Don't you have a job to get to? Or are you just lingering around here and taking up space?" Shaq's eyes widened in surprise. The comment was as rude as it was unfounded. He had no idea what her issue was, but it was clear now that her disdain for him was no longer a quiet, passive thing. It had manifested into open hostility. "I have a job," he replied coolly, doing his best to maintain his composure. "I work from home." "But that's none of your business, is it?" Margaret Ellison's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with something dangerous. Resentment, perhaps, or maybe envy. "No, it's not," she snapped, then glanced at Shadow again. "And that dog of yours, he's a little, much. Don't you think it's like you're trying to make a statement or show off?" Shaq was taken aback. The insinuation that his dog was somehow a show of wealth or status was preposterous. Shadow was just a dog, a loyal companion. But in Diane's eyes, everything he was up for scrutiny. "He's a dog, not an accessory." Shaq said, his voice calm, but with a firmness that made it clear he wasn't going to back down. "And no one's sewing off. I'm just walking him, that's all." But Margaret Ellison wasn't finished. Her expression twisted, and she leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, accusing whisper. "You know I've heard things. People have been talking, Shaq. Some of the neighbors aren't too happy about someone like you moving in here. This isn't the kind of neighborhood for well people like you." The words hung in the air, thick with venom. The shock of hearing such an overtly racist statement left Shaq momentarily speechless. It wasn't new to him. He had faced this kind of discrimination his entire life, but hearing it come from someone who seemed so poised, so respectable, sent a chill down his spine. "Excuse me." Chuck's voice was colder now, his calm facade slipping. "Are you seriously saying what I think you're saying?" Diane's eyes sparkled with a mix of satisfaction and disdain. She was testing him, pushing him to react, to get angry. But Shaq wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "Oh, I'm just saying you don't belong here," Margaret Ellison said, her tone no longer veiled in politeness. "This neighborhood is for people who know how to fit in, people who understand the right way of doing things, not for people like you who try to impose themselves on others." Shaq took a deep breath, feeling the anger rise within him. He clenched his fists, but he refused to let her see him lose control. He could feel Titan's presence beside him, the dog sensing his tension. And for a moment he was reminded that this wasn't just about him. It was about standing his ground, about showing that he wasn't going to be pushed around by someone like Margaret Ellison. "I don't know what you think you know about me," Shaw said, his voice low but steady. "But I'll tell you this. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now, and I've earned everything I have. You, on the other hand, don't seem to understand that." Dan stared at him for a moment, her expression a mix of shock and fury. "You'll regret that," she spat. "Trust me, you'll regret thinking you can just waltz in here and, take over." Shaq stood his ground, staring her down, refusing to let her see his unease. This wasn't the first fight he'd had to face, and it wasn't going to be the last. But one thing was clear. Margaret Ellison had just declared war. As she turned and marched back to her house, Shaq exhaled, the weight of the confrontation sinking in. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Yeah. Shaw had hoped that the confrontation with Margaret Ellison would be an isolated incident, a passing moment of tension that would dissipate with time. But the truth was, things only seemed to escalate from there. The small, unsettling comments continued to come like a drip of water that never quite stopped. Margaret Ellison, sharp words, her calculating stares, and the cold distance from the other neighbors made it clear that Shuck wasn't exactly welcome in this perfect suburban bubble. For a week, he did his best to ignore the whispers, the furtive glances, the sideways comments. He focused on his work, walking Titan in the mornings and evenings, trying to settle into his new life. But it was hard to ignore the ever-growing sense of discomfort in the air. It was as though the neighborhood itself had grown more hostile, as if Shaq had become a target simply by existing in this space. It all came to a head one afternoon, a day that started out like any other but ended in a way that would forever change the dynamic of the neighborhood. Shaq had just finished walking Shadow around the block. The evening air was crisp and the sun had begun to sink, casting long shadows across the pavement. He had his hands in his jacket pockets as he and Shadow made their way back to the house. The dog was happily trotting along, his tongue ling out, but Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had the nagging sensation that someone was watching him again. As they neared the driveway, Shaq heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. He turned to see a police cruiser roll to a stop in front of his house. His stomach dropped, and he immediately tensed. Two officers stepped out of the car, their eyes scanning the street before settling on Shaq. One was a tall, broad-shouldered officer with dark sunglasses, while the other was a shorter woman with sharp features and an impassive expression. Neither of them looked particularly friendly, but Shaq wasn't sure if that was due to the situation or if it was just their natural demeanor. "Can I help you?" Shaq asked, trying to keep his voice even. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he could feel the adrenaline beginning to surge through his veins. The woman officer stepped forward first. "Sir, we received a report about a suspicious individual in the area accompanied by a stolen dog. Is that your dog?" She gestured to Titan, who is now sitting obediently at Shaq's side. Shaq blinked momentarily, taken back by the accusation. "Stlin dog," he repeated, trying to wrap his head around what was happening. "What are you talking about?" The officer's tone remained stern, though she didn't seem particularly concerned. Someone called in a report. They claim that you're in possession of a dog that isn't yours. Can you provide proof of ownership?" Shaq's heart skipped a beat. The accusation was so absurd that it almost seemed like a joke. The officers weren't laughing. He could see that they were taking the report seriously, that I have papers for him. Shaq said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I've had Shadow for years. He's mine. I've got proof." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog's adoption papers, handing them over to the officers. The woman officer took them, flipping through the pages quickly, while the man stood a few feet away, his eyes scanning the street as if he were expecting trouble. "Do you have any security footage of the dog?" the officer asked her, tone softening just a little. "Something that could prove this is your pet." Shaq was starting to get frustrated, but he knew better than to let his anger get the best of him. He nodded, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out his phone. "I've, got footage from my security cameras," he said, unlocking the phone and showing them a video of Shadow playing in the backyard, followed by footage of the dog walking down the street with him. The woman officer watched the footage for a moment, then handed the phone to her partner. The man officer squinted at the screen, his expression unreadable. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice somewhat less accusing. "We'll have to confirm all the details, of course, but based on what we've seen so far, it looks like there's no evidence of any theft here." Shaq let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "So that's it." Someone just called to accuse me of stealing my own dog." The officer nodded. "It appears that way. We'll file a report and follow up. You're free to go, but we may need to speak to you again if anything else comes up." And Shaq stood there for a moment, staring at the officers as they got back in their cruiser and drove off down the street. The anger inside him was rising again, but he kept it in check. The whole situation felt surreal. How could anyone think he'd steal a dog? How could anyone accuse him of something so ridiculous without even bothering to check the facts? As the car disappeared from view, Shaq turned to Titan, who was still sitting by his side, looking up at him with those trusting eyes. "We're not going anywhere, buddy," he muttered, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Not without a fight." It wasn't until later that night, as Shaq was scrolling through his phone, that he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold while waiting for the officers to leave. Shaq had gone inside to check his home security cameras. It wasn't unusual for him to monitor the footage occasionally just to keep an eye on things, especially after the strange tension with his neighbors. But wait, when he opened his computer, he found something he hadn't expected. A private Facebook group linked to Diane's name had popped up in the search results. Curious, Shaq clicked on it, and what he found made his stomach churn. The group was filled with posts, vile, hateful posts, targeting anyone who wasn't white or who didn't fit the mold of what Margaret Ellison and her friends considered appropriate neighbors. There were slurs, racist comments, and detailed descriptions of how to protect their neighborhood from outsiders. And right there in the midst of it all was a post with a picture of Shaq's house, the very one he had just moved into, with a note accusing him of being a threat. Shaq's heart pounded in his chest as he took screenshots of everything, every comment, every post, every detail. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was a calculated campaign to harass him, to run him out of the neighborhood. Margaret Ellison had weaponized the police against him, and now he had the evidence to prove it. This was far from over. Shaq had been in Atlanta long enough to know that things rarely changed overnight. But after that tense interaction with the police, the quiet whispers, and the ongoing passive aggression, it became clear that this neighborhood was never going to accept him. Margaret Ellison had set the tone, and the others were following her lead, whether they realized it or not. The following days felt like an eerie lull. The neighborhood was unusually silent. The usual chirps of birds and hum of air conditioners were almost drowned out by the tension that hung thick in the air. People went about their business, mowing lawns, walking dogs, chatting in small groups, but it was all surface level. The warmth, the camaraderie, the sense of community. None of it seemed to reach Shaq anymore. He noticed it more clearly now. The subtle distancing, the way some neighbors would nod at him, but their eyes would quickly look away. The polite but perfunctory small talk that was never followed by a genuine conversation. Even when he'd say hello to someone walking down the street, their responses would be curt, their body language stiff as though they were just going through the motions. But it was Margaret Ellison and the group of friends she'd begun to associate with that made Shaq's blood boil. Margaret Ellison wasn't just an isolated problem. She had brought her own little clique of the HOA board into the fold. Robert Klein, Patricia Langley, and Barbara Denton. He had seen them in the neighborhood before, always walking in sync with one another, sharing whispered words. But now it became obvious. Every time Shaq walked past them, they would stop talking abruptly, their eyes darting toward him, their heads turning with such precision that it was like they were waiting for him to do something wrong. Shaq couldn't escape. Their eyes couldn't shake the feeling that he was being scrutinized with the utmost care, dissected in every way possible. It was like being under a microscope. Every action exaggerated, every move scrutinized. It made him uncomfortable, like the neighborhood itself was closing in around him, wrapping him in an invisible cage. They weren't overtly hostile. No, not in the open. But the judgment was there, thick in the air like the scent of something foul that you couldn't quite place but knew was there. One afternoon, after another awkward exchange with Robert Klein, Shaq walked back to his house with his shoulders tight, his stomach in knots. He had to admit it. The tension was getting to him. It wasn't just Margaret Ellison anymore. It was the entire neighborhood. He felt like an intruder in a space that was supposed to be his refuge. Shadow seemed to sense it, too. The dog's tail drooping slightly as they approached the front door. Shaq paused on the porch, running a hand through his hair as he looked out over the street. He had moved here for peace and quiet, for a fresh start. But peace had long since been shattered, replaced by a quiet war waged behind smiles and polite exchanges. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. The message was from an unknown number. "Hey, it's me, Nina Harper. You okay? I saw the police cars the other day. Don't let them get to you." "All right, you're better than that. Let me know if you need anything." Shaq stared at the text for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He didn't know who Nina Harper was, but the message was a small glimmer of something that felt real. He quickly typed back, thanking her and telling her he was fine, though the last thing he felt was fine. Just then, there was a soft rustling behind him. Shaq turned around to see Patricia Langley, one of Margaret Ellison's allies, standing at the end of his driveway, holding a clipboard. She was dressed in a bright floral blouse, but even in the midday sun, she looked somehow out of place, like a shadow, hovering just on the edge of the light. "Oh, Shaq," Patricia Langley said with exaggerated cheer, as if they were old friends. "How's everything going? I've been meaning to stop by and welcome you properly, but you know things have been so busy around here lately. I'm with the HOA, and I just wanted to remind you about the rules for lawn care, and, I'm good." Cha cut her off, his tone sharper than he intended. He didn't want to listen to her niceties or her feigned concern. He could see right through her just like he could with Margaret Ellison. This wasn't about the HOA, and it certainly wasn't about rules. It was about control. Patricia Langley blinked clearly, taken aback by the bluntness in his voice. She looked around as if she were trying to regroup to pull herself back into her role as the picture-perfect neighbor. "Well, of course, just let me know if you need anything," she said, trying to mask the tension with a smile. "And of course, if you ever need help with, I'm good, thanks," Shaq repeated a little more forcefully this time. Patricia Langley paused, her smile tightening slightly, and then she nodded stiffly. Without another word, she turned and walked back down the driveway toward Margaret Ellison. This house where the two of them, along with Robert Klein and Barbara Denton, seemed to be, holding court. Shaq stood there for a moment watching her go, and his eyes narrowed as he realized something important. Patricia Langley's attempt to welcome him had been nothing more than an excuse to check up on him, to remind him that he was still being watched. This wasn't about politeness. It was about keeping him in his place. As he watched her retreat into the distance, Shaq's mind began to race. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. This wasn't just casual discrimination. This wasn't about neighborhood rules or misunderstandings. This was a coordinated effort, a plan that had been set in motion the moment he moved in. Margaret Ellison had started the fire, and now her friends in the HOA were feeding the flames, creating a community of silent accomplices who wouldn't do anything to stop it. The isolation was suffocating. Shaq couldn't walk down the street without feeling the eyes on his back. The whisper of judgments behind closed doors. Every smile was a mask. Every hello a reminder that he was not really one of them. It was a strange form of cold warfare, one that was difficult to fight but impossible to ignore. But Shaq wasn't a man who gave up easily. He wasn't going to let Margaret Ellison or anyone else make him leave. He had earned this home, and he was going to fight for it, no matter how many people in the neighborhood tried to make him feel like an outsider. And as he turned and walked back into his house, he knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. Shaq sat at his desk, eyes locked on the computer screen, as he scrolled through various online forums, news sites, and his personal social media accounts. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something wasn't right in his new neighborhood, and his suspicions had only deepened after the confrontation with Patricia Langley. The whispers, the coldness from his neighbors, and the strange behavior of Margaret Ellison and her allies, they were all connected. Shaq could feel it in his gut. There was, a pattern, and it wasn't one that led to a peaceful resolution. He needed answers. Real answers. Shadow was lying at Shaq's feet, his soft snores filling the otherwise quiet room. Shaq was used to working from home, but today he found it hard to concentrate. Every time he tried to focus on something productive, his mind kept drifting back to his neighbors, their passive-aggressive remarks and their cold stares. It was like living in a constant state of unease where every word and gesture felt like a covert challenge. A sudden idea flickered in his mind. Shaq had security cameras around the house, both outside and inside. It was a habit he had developed over the years, a necessary precaution to ensure his safety and peace of mind. But today he realized that there was something he hadn't checked in a while: his backyard cameras. The footage could hold the key to understanding why Margaret Ellison and the others seemed to be targeting him. With renewed purpose, Shaq opened his security app and navigated to the footage of the previous week. He scanned through several hours of uneventful video. Shadow lounging in the backyard, the occasional delivery truck pulling up, and the quiet rhythm of suburban life. But as he scrolled back to a few nights ago, something caught his eye. A figure moving with a strange, deliberate stealth across his property. Shaq's eyes narrowed as he clicked on the timestamp. The figure was clearly visible in the footage, a woman creeping over the fence at the far corner of his yard. He recognized her immediately. It was Margaret Ellison. She was wearing a dark jacket and moving cautiously as if trying to avoid being seen. Shaq sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. Margaret Ellison had been snooping around his property. But what was she doing? What did she want? He clicked on the next video clip, and his stomach dropped. The footage showed Margaret Ellison crouching near the corner of the fence, holding something in her hands. It looked like a leash, a dog leash to be exact. The Shaq felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized what was happening. Margaret Ellison wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. She was actively trying to steal Titan. In the footage, Dean stood still for a moment watching Titan, who was napping in the backyard. Then she slowly advanced toward the dog, her eyes focused on Titan's resting form. Shaq watched in disbelief as Margaret Ellison reached down, attempting to slip the leash over Titan's collar. It was clear that she thought no one was home, and for a brief moment it seemed like she might succeed. But just as she started to pull Titan's leash toward her, the dog woke up, sensing the disturbance. Titan's ears perked, and he gave a low growl. Margaret Ellison froze, her eyes wide with panic. She stood there for a few moments, hesitant, before yanking the leash bag and making a hasty retreat. The footage ended there, but the implications were clear. Dan had been planning to steal Titan, likely in some misguided attempt to prove a point, or further assert her control over the situation. She thought she could take the dog and force Shaq to leave, but what she didn't count on was his vigilance. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking with a mixture of shock and fury. This was no longer about subtle discrimination or whispers behind closed doors. Margaret Ellison had crossed a line. She had attempted a crime, and the footage was irrefutable proof. He quickly began taking screenshots of the key moments in the beginning of the video, saving the files and preparing them for what would surely be his next step. He couldn't let this go. This was more than just harassment now. It was theft. It was an attack on his very right to live in peace. As he gathered the evidence, Shaq felt a surge of determination. He had been patient up until now, trying to avoid escalating the situation. But Margaret Ellison's actions had forced his hand. He was done being passive. It was time to confront her once and for all. But before he could make any plans, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unexpected source. "Hey, Shaq. This is Nina Harper again. I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Margaret Ellison has been posting about you on her private Facebook group again. It's getting pretty ugly. People are starting to talk more openly, and I'm afraid it's only going to escalate." Be careful. Shaq read the message over twice, his heart sinking. He had already seen some of the posts in that Facebook group, but now it seemed like the situation was spiraling further out of control. The whispers he had heard from his neighbors, the strange coldness from the HOA members, it was all coming to a head. Dan wasn't just trying to control the neighborhood anymore. She was mobilizing others against him. She was turning this into a crusade that in her mind would justify any means to get him out of the neighborhood. Shaq quickly typed a response. "Thanks for the heads up, Nina Harper. I already have some footage that proves Margaret Ellison has been tampering with my property. I'm not letting her get away with this." He hit send and sat back in his chair, staring at the screen for a long moment. He had the evidence he needed. Now it was time to make his move. This fight was no longer about being uncomfortable in a neighborhood that didn't want him. This was about justice. Margaret Ellison had tried to take something from him, something that was his by right, and he wasn't going to let her or anyone else get away with it. Shaq stood up from the desk, his resolve hardening. He had work to do, and it wasn't just about confronting Margaret Ellison anymore. It was about making sure the whole neighborhood knew what kind of person she really was. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The air was thick with tension as Shaq stood outside his house, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Shadow lay at his feet, watching him with those alert, intelligent eyes, sensing that something was about to change. Shag had spent the last several days reviewing the evidence, his security footage, the screenshots from Diane's private Facebook group, and the text messages from Carlo, warning him that things were only going to get worse. He knew he couldn't let Margaret Ellison's behavior go unchallenged anymore. This had gone too far, and if he was going to protect his home, his peace, and his dignity, he had to confront her head-on. He'd spent enough time trying to keep things civil, trying to avoid escalating the situation. But Margaret Ellison had crossed the line. She had attempted to steal his dog, weaponized the neighborhood against him, and had now mobilized her allies within the HOA to make his life a living hell. No more waiting, no more playing nice. It was time to take action. Shaq's plan was simple. He would confront Margaret Ellison directly in front of everyone and force her to face the consequences of her actions. He had the evidence. He had the truth. All he needed now was to make her see that he wasn't going to back down. He stood up straight, adjusting his jacket, and glanced at Titan. The dog wagged his tail slightly, as if understanding that his owner was about to face something serious. "Stay close, buddy," Czech muttered, giving the dog a reassuring pat on the head. As he walked toward Margaret Ellison's house, his heart pounded in his chest, but his steps were steady. The street seemed eerily quiet, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Shaq didn't care anymore. This was his neighborhood too, and he wasn't going to let anyone, especially Margaret Ellison, push him around. When he reached Margaret Ellison's front yard, he saw her standing near her porch, talking to Robert Klein and Patricia Langley. The three of them were laughing, but the moment they saw Shaq approaching, their expressions hardened. Margaret Ellison's eyes narrowed, and she straightened up, her posture becoming rigid as if preparing for a confrontation. Shaq didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew that any attempt to be polite would only allow Margaret Ellison to continue playing her manipulative games. "Margaret Ellison!" Shaq called out, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Margaret Ellison froze, her smile faltering for just a second before she regained her composure. "What's this about Shaq?" she asked, her tone dripping with fainted sweetness. I don't know what you're implying, but if this is about the dog again—" "It's not just about the dog," Shaq interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "This is about everything. The way you've treated me, the way you've tried to turn the neighborhood against me, the way you've been using your, position in the HOA to harass me, to make me feel unwelcome in my own home." Margaret Ellison's expression shifted, her facade cracking just a bit, but she quickly regained control, her lips curling into a tight, humorless smile. I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I've done nothing but try to be a good neighbor." Shaq took a step forward, his eyes locking with hers. "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice unwavering. "I've got evidence. I know about your Facebook group, the one where you and your little friends have been posting about me. Racist comments, accusations, trying to turn everyone against me, and I've got the footage of you trying to steal my dog. Don't think I haven't seen it." The change in Margaret Ellison's demeanor was immediate. The color drained from her face, and for the briefest moment, Shaq saw something real, something raw in her eyes. Panic, fear. It was only for a second, but it was enough to show him that he had her right where he wanted her. She quickly composed herself, though crossing her arms defensively. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice now tinged with anger. "You think I'm the only one who feels uncomfortable with you being here. People are talking Shaq. This isn't your kind of neighborhood. You don't fit in." Shaq felt a rush of disgust, but he kept his voice steady. "You think I don't know what you're doing? I know exactly what you're trying to do. Margaret Ellison, you've been using your position in the HOA to push your agenda to make this place a toxic environment for people who don't look like you. You've tried to use everyone else as your pawns in your little game." Robert Klein and Patricia Langley, who had been standing silently by her side, exchanged uncertain glances. Asha could see that they were starting to understand that this wasn't just about him. Margaret Ellison had been manipulating them too. Margaret Ellison's eyes flashed with rage. "Yeah, you think you can come in here and just threaten me," she spat. "I'll have you removed from this neighborhood. You'll be the one who's forced to leave, not me." Shaq stood his ground. No, Margaret Ellison. You're the one who's going to signate to leave. I'm done with your games. You've harassed me. You've manipulated everyone here, and you've broken the law. This neighborhood is about community, not about your personal vendetta. And I'm not going anywhere." A tense silence hung in the air. Shaq could feel the weight of every word, every accusation he had thrown at Margaret Ellison. The ball was now in her court. How would she react? But it was Robert Klein who finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "Margaret Ellison, we didn't know about any of this," he said, his eyes darting nervously between Shaq and Margaret Ellison. "This isn't right." Patricia Langley, too, seemed to be having second thoughts. "We should have known something wasn't right," she muttered almost to herself. Shaq's heart raced. The tide was turning, and Margaret Ellison could sense it, too. Her face twisted with fury, but it was clear now that her power was slipping. She had underestimated him. "You can't do this," Margaret Ellison hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "I'll ruin you. I'll make sure no one in this town ever speaks to you again." Shaq stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with finality. "You've already tried that, Margaret Ellison, and you failed. You won't get away with it anymore." There was a long pause, and then Margaret Ellison turned on her heel, storming toward her. You're out at our front door. You'll regret this," she shouted over her shoulder. But there was no conviction in her voice. The fight had left her. As she disappeared into her house, Shaq took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This wasn't the end, but it was a turning point. He had taken the first step in reclaiming his peace and showing Margaret Ellison and everyone else that he wouldn't be bullied into silence. Shadow trotted up to his side tail, wagging, and Shaq smiled down at the dog. "We're not going anywhere, buddy," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "This is our home." It had been a few days since Shaq's confrontation with Margaret Ellison. The air in the neighborhood seemed a little lighter, but the tension remained hanging in the background like a storm waiting to break. Shaq felt a sense of victory in finally confronting Margaret Ellison, but he knew that this wouldn't be over until she faced the consequences of her actions. Margaret Ellison wasn't the type to let things go quietly, and Shaq could feel her bitterness simmering beneath the surface, just waiting to boil over. The days passed with the usual coldness from the neighbors. A few of them, like Robert Klein and Patricia Langley, avoided eye contact whenever Shaq passed by. Their guilt about their involvement in the HOA's discrimination evident in their stiff postures. But Margaret Ellison was another story. Despite her earlier retreat, Shaq knew she wasn't done. He could sense her seething resentment, her need for control. It wouldn't be long before she took another swing, and Shaq was ready for whatever she threw at him. One evening, as Shaq finished his daily walk with Titan, he came home early from his usual route. It was a quiet evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, and Shadow was panting contentedly beside him as they walked up the driveway. Shaq had been in his own head lately, thinking about how much things had changed since he'd moved into the neighborhood, how quickly everything had escalated, how much he had learned about the length some people would go to in order to maintain their control. But tonight, there was something else in the air. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he approached his house. There was a faint rustling sound from the side yard, the kind of noise that didn't belong. Shaq paused, his senses on high alert. Titan's ears perked up, and the dog gave a low growl. Shaq took a deep breath, his heart beginning to race. Then, without thinking, he moved swiftly toward the sound. As he rounded the corner of his house, his stomach dropped. There, in the dim light, was Margaret Ellison, crouched low near his fence, holding a leash in one hand and something else in her other. Shaq's blood ran cold. Margaret Ellison was trying to lure Titan. "Hey!" Shaq shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Margaret Ellison froze, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected him to come home so early, and now she stood there caught in the act. Shadow barked, confused but clearly alert, his tail stiff. Margaret Ellison's hand tightened on the leash and she stammered as trying to make her next move. What are you doing?" Shaq's voice was thick with disbelief. Margaret Ellison quickly straightened up, attempting to recover from the shock of being caught red-handed. I was just trying to calm your dog down," she stammered, but her words sounded hollow. She was fumbling, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. Shaq took another step forward, his gaze hardening. "You've got to be kidding me! You're trying to steal my dog!" Diane's eyes darted nervously to Titan, then back to Shaq. "No, that's not what I was." Her voice wavered, but she quickly tried to regain her composure. "I was just trying to take care of him. You never know what could happen if he gets loose. You think I don't know how to take care of my dog?" Shaq's anger was palpable now. "You are trying to steal him, Margaret Ellison. Don't even try to lie your way out of this." Shadow growled again, his body tense as if sensing the danger. Shaq could feel the adrenaline rushing through his veins, but he kept his focus, his eyes locked onto Margaret Ellison, who was now looking for a way to backpedal out of the situation. I wasn't stealing him," she said, the words faltering of it. "I just thought he'd be safer with me. I was just trying to enough." Shaq snapped, cutting her off. "You've been stalking me, spreading lies about me, turning the whole neighborhood against me, and now this. This is the last straw." Margaret Ellison. Margaret Ellison's face turned pale as the weight of the situation finally sank in. She realized that Shaq had caught her in the act, and there was no easy way out now. Her facade was crumbling, and she knew it. "I didn't mean it," Margaret Ellison tried to protest, but her voice lacked conviction. The more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. I didn't know what else to do. You don't belong here. You shouldn't be here." Shaq stepped forward, his anger surging. "This is my home, Margaret Ellison, and you've just crossed a line that I'm not willing to ignore anymore." He turned to Titan, who was now barking and wagging his tail in confusion. "You don't mess with my dog. You don't mess with my home. You don't mess with me." With a final defiant look at Margaret Ellison, Shaq pulled out his phone. What? Quickly unlocking it and opening his security app. The camera feed was still running, and Shaq's heart pounded as he watched the footage from earlier in the day. Margaret Ellison's attempted theft of Shadow had been caught on tape. Every moment from her approach to the fence to her failed attempt at grabbing the leash was clearly documented. Margaret Ellison's eyes widened as she saw him pulling up the footage on his phone. What are you doing?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. I'm showing you what happens when you think you can get away with things like this." Shaq said, his voice calm but filled with steel. "I'm not going to let you get away without trying to steal my dog, and I'm sure as hell not going to let you keep terrorizing me or this neighborhood. You've been exposed." Hey, Shaq clicked a few buttons on his phone, sending the video to a secure folder. I've got the footage, Margaret Ellison, and I'm not afraid to share it with the police, or the local news, if I have to." Margaret Ellison's face twisted in frustration and anger. She opened her mouth as though to say something, but no words came out. She was defeated. "You'll regret this," Margaret Ellison finally muttered, her voice thick with resentment. Shaq stood firm, undeterred. "No, Margaret Ellison, you're the one who's going to regret it. I'm done letting you think you can control me. This neighborhood's not yours. Not anymore." Shaq turned on his heel, walking away with Shadow at his side. The feeling of triumph was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about winning this moment. It was about taking back his life. He had taken the first step in showing Margaret Ellison that there were consequences to her actions. As Shaq entered his house, he locked the door behind him and looked down at Titan, who was still wagging his tail, oblivious to the intensity of what had just transpired. It wasn't over yet, but tonight Shaq had taken back control. The following morning, Shaq woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. But despite the calm exterior inside, he felt a storm brewing. The confrontation with Margaret Ellison had been a long time coming, and now the time for playing nice was over. His life had been disrupted too many times by her and the people who supported her. It was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. Shaq had spent the night preparing. He'd gathered all the evidence footage of Margaret Ellison attempting to steal Titan screenshots of the racist and malicious posts from the private Facebook group she ran and the harassing comments that had been circulating about him. The truth was undeniable, and he knew he had the upper hand now. He was no longer just the new guy in the neighborhood. He was the one holding all the cards. As Shaq sat in his living room sipping his coffee, he felt a sense of clarity. He had made the decision to take action, and he wasn't going to stop until Margaret Ellison was held accountable. It was time to put an end to a reign of terror over the neighborhood. The first step was simple. Go to the police. Shaq had made sure everything was in order. The footage was clear and undeniable. Adiane had attempted to steal his dog, and she had been involved in spreading racist propaganda and harassment about him in the neighborhood. It was time to make her pay for her actions. He grabbed his phone, dialed a number, and waited as the line rang. "Hello, this is Detective Raymond Steele," a calm voice answered. "Officer, this is Shaq Thompson. I need to report a crime. I have evidence of someone attempting to steal my dog, and I believe they have been involved in harassing me and others in the neighborhood." Detective Raymond Steele listened carefully as Shaq outlined the situation, detailing the footage he had captured and the messages he had received from concerned neighbors. By the time Shaq finished explaining everything, Detective Raymond Steele was quiet for a moment, processing the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Thompson, this is a serious matter. We'll need you to come down to the station with your evidence so we can make an official report and move forward. We'll also be contacting you about a follow-up investigation." Shaq felt a rush of relief. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when the tables would turn and Margaret Ellison's reign of intimidation would come crashing down. "Thank you, officer, and I'll be there shortly," he said, hanging up the phone. It wasn't long before Shaq arrived at the police station, his nerves a little on edge, but his resolve unwavering. The officers took him to a small interview room where he sat down and carefully presented the evidence he had collected. They watched the footage of Margaret Ellison trying to lure Shadow over the fence, heard the recordings of her trying to manipulate the HOA, and read through the screenshots of the hateful posts she had shared in the private Facebook group. Detective Raymond Steele and his partner exchanged glances, clearly shocked by the extent of Diane's behavior. "This is more than just harassment," Detective Raymond Steele said, shaking his head. "This is theft, coercion, and defamation. We'll need to move forward with charges." Shaq felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The truth was finally out, and Margaret Ellison would have to face the consequences of her actions. "I appreciate it, officer. I just wanted her to stop. I wanted her to leave me and my neighbors alone. We'll make sure that happens." Detective Raymond Steele assured him, "You did the right thing by coming forward. I.O. will begin our investigation right away." Shaq left the station that day, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but he had taken a major step in securing his peace. Margaret Ellison would no longer be allowed to terrorize him or the neighborhood. She would be held accountable for the damage she had caused. The next day, Shaq received a phone call that confirmed everything was moving forward. The police had issued a warrant for Margaret Ellison's arrest. They had gathered enough evidence to charge her with trespassing, attempted theft, filing a false police report, and harassment. The charges were serious, and Shaq knew that Margaret Ellison would now face the consequences of her actions. Word quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. Margaret Ellison, once the queen bee of the HOA, was now under investigation for her crimes. Neighbors who had been silent or distant began to approach Shaq with apologies, their guilt written all over their faces. They had been complicit in allowing Margaret Ellison's behavior to go unchecked for so long. And now they were realizing the full extent of what had been happening behind closed doors. Robert Klein, the once supportive neighbor who had been Dan's ally, approached Shaq a few days later. "Shaq, I don't know what to say," he stammered. I had no idea it had gone this far. I'm sorry. I didn't realize what she was really doing." Shaq looked at him with a mixture of frustration and understanding. You should have known," he said quietly. "But it's not too late to do the right thing now." Robert Klein nodded, clearly ashamed. "You're right. I'll do whatever I can to help make things right." Patricia Langley and Barbara Denton, too, offered their apologies. They had been duped by Diane's manipulative tactics, but now that the truth was out, they were ready to help Shaq clear his name and put an end to the toxic environment she had created in the neighborhood. As the days passed, the HOA began to take action. Margaret Ellison was removed from her position as a board member, and the neighborhood slowly started to rebuild. The tensions that had once been so palpable began to dissipate as neighbors came together to support Shaq and rebuild the sense of community that Margaret Ellison had so ruthlessly torn apart. Shaq knew that things wouldn't be perfect overnight. The scars Margaret Ellison had left behind wouldn't fade immediately, but the worst was over. He had stood up for himself, for Titan, and for what was right. The victory wasn't just in getting Margaret Ellison removed from the HOA. It was in reclaiming his peace of mind and his place in the neighborhood. As he sat on his porch that evening, shadow by his side, Shaq looked out over the neighborhood with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. The sun was setting, casting a beautiful golden light across the street. He had fought for this. He had won. And for the first time since moving in, he felt truly at home. Yet the quiet hum of the neighborhood had returned. But it was a different kind of quiet now, one tinged with uncertainty and change. The fallout from Margaret Ellison's actions had been swift, and the ripple effects had rippled through the entire community. Cha had known that once he made his stand, things wouldn't be the same. But now that the dust had settled, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of justice and relief. It had been a week since Margaret Ellison had been arrested. The police had gathered enough evidence to charge her with trespassing, attempted theft, and filing false reports. Her reputation, once untouchable, was now in tatters. The HOA had swiftly removed her from the board, and it wasn't long before the other neighbors started to see her for what she truly was. The once untouchable Queen Bee had fallen, and there was no denying it. Shaq had noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere as he walked, Titan, through the neighborhood. There were no more cold stares or whispers behind his back. The neighbors who had once given him the silent treatment now waved to him with genuine warmth, their guilt for their previous silence apparent in their hesitant smiles. Some, like Robert Klein and Patricia Langley, even stopped to apologize for not seeing the truth sooner. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small step in the right direction. For the first time since moving in, Shaq felt like he could breathe. But the true healing hadn't come from the apologies, or the apologies from his neighbors. It came from knowing that Margaret Ellison had finally been held accountable for her actions. She had used her position in the HOA to make his life miserable, manipulating and controlling the lives of those around her. But now her power was gone. The lies she had woven had unraveled, and she would have to face the consequences. There was no longer any question about who the neighborhood would stand behind. Margaret Ellison had lost, and Shaq had won. Shaq sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on Shaq's foot, as the two of them enjoyed the peace they had fought so hard to preserve. It had been a long road to get here, but Shaq finally felt at peace in his home. The neighborhood was no longer a battleground. It was a place where he could truly relax, a place where he could build the life he had dreamed of. As the days passed, Shaq noticed the neighborhood slowly beginning to change for the better. People who had once kept their distance were starting to reach out to him, inviting him to barbecues, offering to help with small projects around the house. It was as if the entire community was coming together to rebuild what had been broken. One evening, Shaq received an unexpected visitor. It was Nina Harper, the neighbor who had been one of the first to reach out to him after his confrontation with Margaret Ellison. She stood at the end of his driveway holding a casserole dish in her hands, a warm smile on her face. "I know we haven't had the chance to really talk," Nina Harper said, her voice soft. "But I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. I know I could have done more to help you." Shaq stood up from his chair and walked over to her, extending his hand. "It's okay, Nina Harper. You've done enough. I appreciate you speaking up when you did." Nina Harper hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. "You're a good man, Shaq. I know it wasn't easy for you to stand up to Margaret Ellison, but you did it. You did the right thing." Shaq smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just about Margaret Ellison. It was about all of us. We all deserve to live here in peace. And if I hadn't said something, who knows how much longer she would have kept doing this to other people. Nina Harper nodded, her eyes brighten. "Well, I think you've made a real difference. The whole neighborhood's talking about what happened, and it's not just about Margaret Ellison. People are realizing that we need to stand up for each other for what's right." And Shaq looked around at the neighborhood, at the homes where people were now coming together, working to make things right. It was a small victory, but it was one that mattered. "It's going to take time," Shaq said, his voice thoughtful, "but at least we're starting to make progress." Nina Harper handed him the casserole dish, and Shaq took it with a smile. "Thank you. You didn't have to do this, but I appreciate it." "I wanted to," Nina Harper said. "You deserve to feel welcome here." "We all do." As she left, Shaq stood at the end of his driveway, looking around at the quiet suburban street. The neighborhood felt different now. There was a sense of unity in the air, a feeling that things were slowly starting to change for the better. Shaq had proven that standing up for what's right could make a difference. His fight for peace had brought the truth to light, and now it was clear that things were going to be different. Later that evening, as Shaq sat back down on the porch, the glow of the setting sun casting long shadows on the street, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had been through a lot, facing discrimination, harassment, and attempts to strip him of his place in this community. But now, he had finally won. Not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been silent for too long, who had allowed one person's toxic influence to poison the air. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on Shaq's lap as he scratched the dog's ears, feeling the calm of the evening settle over him. He had faced down an enemy who seemed insurmountable, and he had emerged victorious. It wasn't just about Margaret Ellison anymore. It was about proving that no matter who you were or where you came from, you had the right to stand tall, to fight for what was yours, and to demand respect. The war was over, and in the end, justice had been served. Sometimes all it takes is a single moment, one wrong phone call, one bold confrontation to reveal the truth that's been hiding in plain sight. Jamal Brooks didn't just stand up for himself. He stood up for every quiet voice that's ever been silenced, every neighbor who's ever felt like an outsider in a place they call home. And while the story may have started with a puppy, it ended with a neighborhood finally forced to confront its reflection. But now we want to hear from you. Was Jamal right to expose what he uncovered? Do you think Diane truly believed she was protecting the neighborhood, or was it something far more sinister? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved, you hit that like button. Subscribe to Soulful Stories Foo for more powerful real-life tales that challenge prejudice, inspire strength, and spark the conversations we all need to have. Because sometimes, a story isn't just a story. It's a mirror, and it's time we all took a look.